this is Kaja Bryx for Racjonalista.tv, and I have a pleasure to speak with Giulio Ercolessi, who is the president of European Humanist Federation. Hello, Giulio. How are you?
Hello.
As you probably know, in the last year there have been attempts to change the Polish abortion law to ban it completely, as if it was not enough that in fact abortion is illegal. As a humanist, I'm quite sure that you support legalization of abortion and not the opposite trend. But how would you explain it? How would you present your position in favor of legal abortion?
Well, I did it for 1 year in 1975, actually, when abortion was first declared. The law prohibiting abortion in Italy was first declared unconstitutional by the Constitutional Court, and then we had a new law, which on paper was rather restrictive, but then it became more simple to use for women who needed it. But in the last few decades it has been somehow jeopardized by the organization by the Catholic Church of a number of doctors and nurses objecting. By the way, on this point of the objection of conscience, it was this idea was born, as you know, concerning military service in the time of World War I, 1 century ago, but it was for an activity that was not chosen by the persons objecting. It was forced to be members of the military because it was compulsory, given that the law obliged people. So in that case, it made sense, and possibly it could make sense to introduce the conscientious objection for those who were already doctors or nurses when the abortion laws were introduced in each country. But you could also be very liberal and say, okay, we extend this privilege to those that were attending the first year of their studies of medicine when the abortion law was introduced. Afterwards, in my opinion, it makes no sense, because the people who decided to be gynecologists perfectly knew what the job was about, because the law already existed. So in my opinion, those who decided to become gynecologists in public structures after the introduction of abortion laws in our countries should not be allowed to be conscientious objectors. That I'm talking about this because this is the biggest problem concerning abortion in Italy today. And the point is that they should be allowed to practice medicine in other fields than gynecologists, as gynecologists, or they could be gynecologists in the private sector, if and where it exists. But why are you? There is no duty of being a gynecologist in a public hospital. So if you chose to do that when you already knew that the abortion law existed, why are you now claiming the privilege not to perform abortions, which is something that is provided for by the laws? Anyway, if the general question is concerned and not just the implementation of existing laws, I think that we should try to make a step forward nowadays, because we usually advocate the right for abortion or the right to artificial insemination of sterile couples, or we discuss about the freedom of research on embryonic stem cells research, which is a very promising field for the future of medicine. And we usually discuss these things in very practical terms, and we let our opponents to occupy the field of ethical discussions. We do not confront their assertion that the human embryo is a human person from the beginning, from the very beginning. The argument of our opponents is that you cannot or you should not authorize abortions, that you should not authorize any artificial insemination that includes the possible destruction of the so-called supranumerary embryos. And you should never ever think of any scientific research on stem cells research, because it is a way of killing a person. Now I think we should confront our opponents and ask them whether they would be prepared to face all the consequences of what they are saying. Take this example, for example. A house is burning. You have only time to rescue, either on one end of the building, a couple of children desperately crying for help, or on the opposite side of the building, you have no time to do both things, a freezer containing hundreds of embryos, of frozen embryos. What do you choose? If you are really serious when you say that the embryo in itself, even when it is just one cell or a very limited number of cells, even if it is something of less than 1 millimeter inside, has the same value and is actually a human person, the consequence, the obvious necessary consequence is that you should let the two children desperately crying for help burn alive and rescue the 100 embryos, because rescuing 100, let's say, persons is better than rescuing just 2. This is one of the obvious consequences that our opponents should face. The other one, for example, a woman tries to have an abortion, she does not succeed. Well, what would you do if a person tries to kill another person and does not succeed? Of course, you should take her in custody and force her to give birth to a person. You can't let a person stay in the hands of somebody who tried to allegedly kill the other person. And even the penalty that you should foresee should be the highest penalty that is provided for by the different criminal systems. And for voluntary and premeditated murder, the sanction usually is life in prison. Are you prepared to say that whatever woman or doctor or nurse is taking part in an abortion should go to life in prison? If you are not prepared to say this, how can you at the same time say that abortion is a crime and that the embryo is a human person? It is obvious that it is totally inconsistent. Pope John Paul once said, once even compared the abortions that are permitted in our countries and have been permitted in our countries in the last few decades to the extermination of Jews by the Nazis. Is he serious? No one is seriously arguing about this, because it is so absurd that no one is able to take it seriously. Otherwise, abortion should be one of those gross violations of human rights, such as the Pope said genocide, that are imprescriptible, no statute of limitation, like torture, mass murder, genocide, or things like that. And it should be punished with the highest penalty that is provided for by a legal system. In the United States, in those states where there is still the death penalty, you should propose the death penalty for doctors, nurses, and for the women who accepted to have an abortion. If you do not, you are not serious. You understand that it is impossible to implement and to take seriously this thing that you assert as if it were natural. It is not natural at all. There is a lot of Christians that don't really take seriously the idea that the embryo of 1 millimeter is a human being. It's not a human being. It could become a human being if it develops, if it is implanted in the womb of the mother, and if it is born, unless it is just something that could happen. And you can't try to silence your opponent's views saying, but you also were an embryo before. For that matter, we also were dust before being, but this is not a good reason to revere dust. And it is quite obvious that an embryo could become a human person, but he could become a human person in the same way as an ovum and a spermatozoa could become an embryo if there is an intercourse, if they fertilize each other, and if the embryo then develops and becomes a fetus. Otherwise, it is ridiculous, it is inconsistent, because the consequences that come immediately and necessarily out of the principle that says that the embryo is a human being are impossible to support even by the most fanatic person supporting the idea that the embryo is a human person.
Let me stop you there, because in fact some of these arguments which you used, well, like an imprisonment of a woman who wants to do abortion, were actually suggested in the new abortion law in Poland, and in fact, it's also in place in one of the countries in South America. So actually. And I'm afraid that in Poland we have enough crazy people to take the John Paul II's words about genocide in this regard seriously. And that's why they were proposing to ban abortion completely and to establish really high penalties for both doctors and women. So it was up to 15 years in prison.
And what is the penalty in Poland for premeditated voluntary murder?
Well, I guess that was higher.
Usually it is life in prison. Were these people prepared to say life in prison? If not, they are not serious, of course. They don't take seriously what they say, because the consequence is absurd, because the premise is absurd. In the history of the Catholic Church itself, popes, councils, theologians, priests never had this idea that the embryo per se was a human being. They considered the fetus, not just the embryo, but the fetus inanimated, not having a soul, until it seems to me 3 months in case of a male and 6 months in case of the woman. And so they cannot claim that it is an obvious truth that is now obvious because of scientific research, that nowadays they can say that the embryo is a person, because it is not a scientific concept. A scientist can say what an embryo is, what a blastocyst is, what a zygote, or however it is pronounced in English, is, but they can't say what a person is, because it is not a scientific, it is a philosophical concept. So if the Catholic Church itself was not on these positions until more or less the 17th century. Only few voices were in favor of the idea that the embryo and the fetus were human persons until the 17th century. And it became a doctrine of the Catholic Church only in the 19th century. It came into canon law only in 1917. Before, what was the position of it before? Before, it was considered like a chicken. The abortion of a fetus of less than 3 months, 6 months if it was a woman, was considered more or less as valuable as a chicken. It would be probably more correct to say that an embryo that has just developed a little bit more than a single cell, but has not yet any nervous system, is similar to a celenterate, or however it is pronounced in English. And why should we accept as an obvious moral truth something that not even Christians inside their communities accept unanimously, and that no Catholics, or very few Catholics, maybe someone in Poland, but most Catholics in most countries do not accept as an obvious thing that the embryo is a person. And the evidence that they do not accept this is that they do not provide the maximum penalty that is provided for premeditated and voluntary murder in case of abortion. Not even then. Why? They can't claim that it is just a matter of consciousness of the gravity of behavior, that the eclipse of moral values, that they probably would say, cannot be punished in the same way as a murder because the consciousness is no longer there, because even our secular jurisprudence that they consider relativistic has rejected this principle with the Nuremberg and Tokyo trials of war criminals. Probably the Nazi and the Japanese war criminals, and Eichmann, that was later trialed in Jerusalem, were not conscious of the gravity of what they were doing, and yet they were sentenced to the maximum penalties provided for by the existing laws, because our so-called relativistic jurisprudence did not accept the kind of relativism that would be necessary to say that you do not punish abortion with the highest penalty provided for by the criminal law just because of a matter of consciousness on the part of the culprit. So they don't take seriously what they are saying. Why should we follow them on a ground where they themselves are not able to be consistent with what they are saying?
Well, I do hope your words will not inspire anyone to actually change their opinion towards proposing a death penalty or at least life imprisonment for abortion.
I would hope that they propose it, because that would be the evidence that it is inconsistent, that people would not follow them on that ground, I suppose, not even in Poland, even if you are so pessimistic about the attitude of Catholics in Poland. But I would not expect that even the Vatican would accept that their bishops in Poland say that the woman that commits an abortion should be punished with with a life sentence, or the doctors or the nurses, and so on, so on, and so on. You think so?
I don't know, but I definitely think it's so ridiculous that maybe people would finally see it. So thank you very much for this suggestion, and I think that's been a very interesting argument against delegalizing abortion. That's been a tendency not only in Poland right now, but in a few other countries in Europe as well.
It is in English on my website. I will give you the link. It's www.Giulio Ercolessi with the double s.eu.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.